The Season 7 League of Legends World Championship has reached the semi-final stage where we have two matchups that are between a Chinese team and a Korean team. So on one side of the bracket, we have SK Telecom versus RNG. And on the other side, we have WE, formerly known as World Elite, versus Samsung Galaxy. Now, if you want to bet on who you think will win either of these matchups, you can do so at esports pools, depending on which part of the world you come from. Now, following TSM's failure at the very same World Championship and a third straight year of failing to progress past the group stage and into the playoff bracket, people understandably who are fans of TSM or just interested in the top Western teams or perhaps NA fans in general have been disappointed, frustrated. Some of them have actually grown angry, despondent, they despair. People, understandably, have blamed players, they've isolated coaches and suggested coaches should be fired or replaced or changed in terms of where they are in the hierarchy. Last year, when the team came in very, very strong, people also cited issues with environment, not being able to practice against top Korean teams, unlike a lot of the Asian region. Burnout from having played so much and been under Weldon Green's approach, where he had them practicing about as much in theory as you can as a Western team. There's all these different areas people looked to to blame or to criticize or to suggest something needs to be fixed. But one area I feel actually has been overlooked this year, and I don't certainly mean in terms of blame, I'm not particularly interested in that, but in terms of an area that I think there are some obvious flaws and the approach doesn't seem sound from my perspective, and I would like to see a TSM look into and perhaps improve or just entirely change, is actually Reginald's involvement with the team in terms of being a hands-on owner. Because, I mean, as the title of this video says, you could basically summarize it as saying that Reginald doesn't delegate, at least in the traditional sense of how you reasonably would delegate something to someone. And this is an issue that I have referenced in the past in a video. It was actually before Season 5 Worlds when they had that whole internal collapse where Loco Doco was somewhat replaced but still taken to Worlds. Obviously, the team did terribly in the group there. They obviously lost the NALCS finals. It was one of the most trying and troublesome splits that they had as a team was summer of Season 5. And a lot of that video at the time was about what is Loco Doco's role. But I think actually some of the issues that the seeds of which I noticed there have now borne fruit. And we still see a lot of the same issues on a systemic level within TSM. And some of them, I think, stem from Reginald and his approach to the team. And so this is something I want to discuss because he isn't just a hands-on owner. He is such a hands-on owner at all levels on the overall recruitment, on the coaching staff, how the coaching staff coach, and then the players, and then how they play, and then how they're supposed to frame and interpret and assess losses which have just taken place. That normally, yes, you would already consider the role of an owner in the success of an organization because, yeah, ultimately the responsibility ends with the owner anyway because they're top of the food chain and they do pick the people and pick the players and put them in positions. But normally they then let those people that they've picked make the decisions, make the plays, make the moves that then ultimately yield the success or failure, which, yes, ultimately the owner is responsible for. But Reginald is such a hands-on owner that I think actually at all levels of the hierarchy, you have to factor him in contextually to understand why and how things happened. Because that is the key distinction with Reginald. He doesn't delegate in as much as to delegate, you have to kind of do it entirely. You have to be willing to say, this is going to be your task. This is going to be your job. You're going to do it. Yes, afterwards I might assess whether you did a good job of it, or I might check up on it and ask how are things going, or is there a reason why things are going this way? But to delegate means to give up some of that control, to give up the reins. Traditionally, you think of how coaches work in esports teams, in sports teams in general. The usual approach is you hire a coach that you think is the right guy for your team and to take you to whatever level of success, whatever expectations you have for the team. You then, after hiring him, let him do his job. Now, as an owner, you might be involved elsewhere with who's recruited because that's actually the task of someone else outside of esports. The general manager is the one who picks the players to hire, decides what to do with contracts, sells them. Now, yes, some owners are more involved there, but Reginald's involved in all aspects, seemingly all levels of TSM. And so he doesn't just let his coaches coach. I mean, the usual approach, as I said, is you hire the guy you think's right for the job, and then you let him do the job, right? But Reginald has repeatedly involved himself and seemingly at times micromanaged his coaches even. So with Loco Doco, you could see him, Reginald this is, in and around the team seemingly all the time, after matches, before matches, during periods where normally it would be the coach assessing what happened in the match, or giving people little pieces of advice, or saying, right, we're going to talk privately, like one-on-one about what happened in that game, addressing things as a group, addressing things privately. Instead, it's often Reginald who's taking a leading role in that, who's the main voice that people are sat down and listening to. Sometimes you could be forgiven for thinking there wasn't a coach in the room. He's just a guy sat off over here, like all the players who are all sat silent. When these discussions happen, there's not a lot of back and forth. It's mainly Reginald who seems to be doing it. And so at times with Loco Doco, he seemed to either undermine Loco Doco's authority or even to some degree overrule Loco Doco. Then you have Path. After Loco Doco's gone, after Woodbuck's been and gone, you have Path. So again, Path is the coach. Path is the head coach. He's the guy who's deciding how they're going to play, coaching the team. And yet Reginald's the one there again giving speeches. He's the one telling players at times how to play the game. This is something that I'll touch on later in terms of telling the players how to play the game. But remember, there was a coach between Loco Doco and Woodbuck and Path, which was this guy, Casey Woodbuck, you might remember, who came in, and he was a guy who had experience from outside of League of Legends with like baseball or something. And he's someone where some of this information I'm about to tell you, I was able to glean from a text interview I did with Casey Woodbuck, which I will release. I just haven't got around to releasing it. It obviously wasn't super pertinent to season 6 or season 7. And so it's something I'll release in the forthcoming weeks. And it gives some insight into his experience in TSM and how things worked and kind of the timeline of things. And basically, when he hired Woodbuck, after a week of LCS, there was already discussions going on within TSM from Reginald and other people that Woodbuck was ineffective, and they already were looking into potentially replacing him after 1 week of LCS, 1 week of official games, and his job was to be the head coach. You had Path as well, who was going to be strategical coach. Woodbuck was the head coach. Now, Reginald wanted to let Woodbuck go, but Woodbuck argued basically, like, well, give me a chance to actually work here. Give me time to work. You can't just fire me after a week. So what Reginald gave an offer, either you can leave or you can spend the next month trying to improve and try and, prove me wrong. Woodbuck decided to stay, tried to work, tried to prove him wrong, but in the end was let go regardless. Now, in this scenario, when you have a coach, you've got to let him work, not just because he's got to be given a full chance to do something, but because it's also just naive to imagine that he's going to come in and change the whole culture of your team in all the ways it needs to be and implement his entire system of how to coach and how he's going to work with people and then how it's going to impact the game within a few weeks, within 1 week, within 2 weeks, within 3 weeks, without chance to play official games, to have actual proper results, not just scrim results and things that seem to be working well in conversation, but does it work in practice? Can the theory be applied and practically does it work? If you don't let the person work in terms of actual practice, in terms of results, then you're not going to be able to give him a chance to use a feedback system of his own to see this is what works differently in a real game from a practice game, and give him time to tweak both what he's doing and his own system and apply other elements of his system. Maybe when he comes in, he's setting the ground rules, he's setting some basic boundaries, and then he starts to build his system out. You've got to give him time to do that. And then if he fails, yes, you say, right, this was the wrong coach, or it was the wrong coach for my team, or it was the wrong coach for the kind of culture I'm trying to build. Yes, I replace him. But here's what's great. First of all, now you'll know what to look for in your next coaching staff. And also, now you will know that guy failed. You'll know I gave him a full chance and it didn't work out. If, like with Loco Doco, you take him off the team as the head coach, or you undermine him, or you come in and say, I need to talk to him about this, or you say, I'm going to fire someone after a couple of weeks, you actually can never really know that guy failed. And also, you won't really then know what qualities you need in a future coach or future coaching staff. And so this is actually an issue for me, because in traditional sports, you typically get a whole season to coach, not just because of how contracts work, but because you want to give a guy a time to fully work with all the players. Some players are more trickier than others to coach, so it'll take him time to get to work with those players. Some of them, he might initially say, right, well, that's less of an important one, so I'm going to leave that one towards the end. I'm going to work on this important piece here. You can't work on everything at once. In fact, that is an important concept within the coaching paradigm that I would like to stress, which is, from all the material I've read about coaching from expert coaches, you work very slowly. You pick a small item, right? Yes, you set broad strokes initially, but then you pick a small detail, you start to tweak that, and you try to get it implemented, integrated, then you move on to other aspects. If you come in and you tweak a million things all at once and you tell someone 10 different things to fix, they won't be able to handle it. It'll be too much information overload, and actually trying to adjust and tweak and fix 10 different things at once will often make the person much, much worse immediately than their level was before when they were doing all these things wrong, seemingly. It's better to let small change happen and small things be implemented and altered, so then you can see what the effect on everything is. Sometimes you might even have to do other things later on, but you have to let these things gradually happen. So it's the same with coaching a whole squad as well. So I understand to a degree why Reginald kind of inserts himself here and short circuits the system and says, right, I'm going to have to intervene here, because a lot of the coaches he's had have fallen down in terms of being an authority figure, in terms of commanding the respect of their players. And as such, when Reginald sees things are going badly in the game, or he sees some kind of a flaw, like even when they won a game, they won in a very sloppy fashion, and he thinks, right, this isn't going to work at Worlds, or we might not win LCS if this happens. I understand the impulse in him to want to go, right, well, I think I know how I can fix this. I can talk to these guys. I can get through to these guys and come in and start talking to them. The problem there is, does he ever equip his coaches to be the authority figure? Does he delegate that? Because, I mean, you look at Loco, he's someone who throughout his team at TSM and going into Team Liquid, the reason why Breaking Point, so much of that's Loco getting wrecked is, Loco isn't someone naturally who can command respect in the same way. You can respect his mind and the way it works, or his history as a player, but he couldn't get players to be on board with him as the coach overwhelmingly. He's had issues with star players and with certain figures, especially people who are willing to talk back, who are willing to battle him a bit. He has his problems then, how to deal with it. Then you look at Path. Path is a very soft-spoken, mild-mannered guy. Obviously, he wasn't even originally supposed to be the head coach, but he is the head coach. They have not, in the meantime, hired a head coach. Therefore, he is the head coach and must be judged as a head coach. And in that respect, he falls down. He does not manage to fulfill the role as the authority figure, as someone who can seemingly discipline people properly, or who can impart these messages and lessons that Reginald himself is trying to go ahead and do. So part of the problem here is the responsibility for this does lie with Reginald, but he's trying to fix it directly. But it lies with Reginald in as much as it's Reginald who hires these guys and keeps these guys as head coaches until these problems occur, and then inserts himself, thinks he's fixed it briefly, and then pulls himself back again, lets them reassert themselves as the head coach. And so you never really get either a fix in the coaching structure to become strengthened and become what you want it to be, so you don't have to insert yourself. And also, it's just a band-aid fix, isn't it? It's going to work very briefly, but you can't keep doing that over and over again. It's not the ideal approach, ultimately. So I have one of these theories, okay, that one of the reasons why I think Reginald does this actually plays into how I see him as when he was a pro player. Because one of the famous qualities that actually, I mean, I don't know how many people have said this publicly. I know I've said it publicly, but something that a lot of us thought when Reginald was a player, actually, which is that you looked at the way TSM worked. Part of the reason why people used to say TSM goes as far as Reginald takes them is because, yes, Reginald was a star player. Reginald did call the game around himself. But also, you look at the people he had around him in that team, and he did recruit people where, if you want to use the very simplistic model for a second of like alpha males who are very assertive, they want to be in control, they want to have their say, and beta males, the idea, the person who will submit to the alpha, who wants the alpha to tell them what to do, who kind of just will be subservient to them. Now, it's not a perfect model for human society. Remember, it was essentially a model originally used, funnily enough, with primates, which is obviously not something I'm referring to here. Unfortunate case, right? But I'm going to apply it here just to use a very simplistic model to explain this, okay? So Reginald does seem to recruit people who either, I'm talking about for coaches who are non-alphas or are betas in this respect, just as when he was the in-game leader and a pro star player for TSM, Reginald seemed to repeatedly surround himself by people who were like that as teammates. He would get people who would listen unquestioningly to what he said and let him have the full say. And he would be able to tell everyone what to do at these point in times. And he would be able to even coach someone at their position, even though at their position, they are better than Reginald is at their position, but Reginald's a star at a different position. They would take on board what he said. And therefore, he was able to be something of a control freak and have a lot of success from it domestically and have the full control asserted over his team that he wanted to, but it feels like he tries to do that as a coach as well. Because you think to yourself, what happened to people who did stand up to him as teammates, as players? So we've got Chaos, Special, to a degree, even Rainman early on. They end up gone from TSM fairly soon after their friction, after them standing up to Reginald. Part of that, by the way, I think is a feedback loop. I think it's the fact that because he recruits people who don't really stand up to him and let him take this leadership figure in all respects, it means that then when someone stands up, they're also standing out. It's not a big discussion and people have a lot of opinions. Everyone else is kind of silent and sat back. Like, you remember when Chaos and Reginald were having those arguments? And it's just the person standing up, seemingly, how dare you defy my authority? It's that kind of a situation, right? It seems even worse that this person is standing up because no one else does. So their silence seemingly makes them implicit within this entire framework that you're not supposed to stand up to Reginald. So to a degree, you can see why he's ended up with coaches who don't seemingly push back against this structure or this system and who let him come in and intervene and sometimes short circuit their approach and then actually maybe sometimes even tell players things that the coach wouldn't necessarily want to tell them directly. Then you have to factor in as well, Reginald is an intimidating figure. Even as he has mellowed over the years and matured, there's a degree to which you get the sense the people he has hired as a coach just quite frankly will not stand up to him and say, listen, let me coach, let me do my job. And you know what, at the end of the split, if we don't win, if we don't do what you need, fire me. But for now, let me do my job, let me do this. Don't come into the meetings. Like, if you've got notes, yes, let's have meetings, pass them to me. If you want to talk to players privately, sure, do that. But I'll address the players. I'll tell them what they've done wrong. I'll coach players individually. I'll decide the overall approach. And you're my boss. You sign my checks and you fire me at the end of the split or you don't renew my contract. It's hard to believe there's ever been anyone like that as a coach for TSM. And I see that as a problem because you go and you look at the Korean teams, and I think the structure they have there is something TSM should look to because it would actually take care of this issue. So we know in Korean teams, a lot of people in the West don't know this because actually they modeled what they thought Korean teams were like on what they thought Western teams were like. So for example, everyone seems to think that Koma is the head coach of SK Telecom, always has been and always will be. Koma is the strategical coach of SK Telecom. They have another coach who's the head coach, and all the teams there have had different head coaches, and the head coach's role isn't to micromanage aspects of the players or to micromanage his strategical coach. He's coaching the overall approach. How do we set up practices, disciplining players, sometimes recruitment of players, taking on board what a strategical coach says, but letting a strategical coach work. Now, yes, I will give Reginald credit. He tried that with the Woodbuck guy, and it didn't really work out. And admittedly, from hearing things about Woodbuck and the way and things were going, I can certainly see a case for cutting the experiment short and that maybe it was a misstep in terms of what they thought they were getting from him and that things fell apart. I mean, as you'll see in the interview when it comes out with Woodbuck, it sounds like they didn't necessarily do the greatest job recruiting him, and therefore I think there was problems from day one in that respect. But you've also got to look at this. Reginald doesn't also seem to let players play the game. I mean, typically, again, you get players, especially when you've got some of the best players in your region or in the world, you get them and you trust one thing first and foremost. This guy knows how to do his job. Now, yes, he might not always know how to do his job in the context of the team, so you might give him information about how he can better play with a teammate, or when he's doing something that individually he might think's good, but doesn't work in the context of what the team was trying to accomplish, what the win condition was. Even so, you let the player play the game individually, and then you let his coaches work with him in that respect, in terms of how he's working in the overall unit and what his priority is within the team and who he has to give up to and who will help him and how he will be helped and therefore how the team will play and what his place will be within it. Again, that's why you delegate to the coach. Then the coach delegates to the player some degree of autonomy on how he plays, but the coach has the say on how he plays. Because someone like Reginald, who's the owner, who's a leader in that sense, right? Okay, he can involve himself with players in these respects, in trying to motivate them, give them speeches, tell them, you can do this, guys. Like, we believe in you. You've made us proud. Give them moral support. Also, similar things. You're really good players. You won LCS. You're going to do well here. That loss doesn't matter. Like, bounce back from it. He can even involve himself in discipline. Let's say the players are being subordinate to their coach, or they're insubordinate rather. They're not listening to their coach, or they're having arguments with them, or they're talking back in scenarios where it's unproductive, or showing up the coach in front of everyone. Now, I can certainly understand why Reginald, just as Steve Arnesen, Liquid 112 did in the Breaking Point document, he might insert himself there and say, right, I've got to directly be the leader and sort of go to this guy who's a player causing friction and say, I'm going to have to discipline you, perhaps privately, perhaps publicly. I can certainly understand these reasons for involving yourself. But there are many videos now where Reginald directly involves himself in team meetings about how the players played the game, strategical decisions they made, individual decisions. So in Season 5, you might remember there was a video where in the TSM Legends series where he was, I think it was actually something I referenced in that first video, where he was critiquing Dyrus's choice of boots in the game. Now, in that scenario, Dyrus is a top laner who would be one of the better top lanes in NA for a long time and definitely knows how the top lane role is played. Now, in that scenario, first of all, Reginald doesn't really have a place criticising him anyway. But let's say Reginald decides, I think I know better in this case. You're also in that scenario, if your top laner really is mismanaging his boots on a regular basis, he probably shouldn't be your top laner after that split. After his contract runs out, you should get a top laner that you don't need to criticise his boots choice and his item builds, that you can trust that this guy's good and will do item builds and play within the context of the team. I mean, we remember in Season 5, Wild Turtle used to be told not to flash forwards. They used to joke with him that he shouldn't ever use his flash key aggressively. Now, again, that just means that is a player who shouldn't be your AD carry. First of all, you shouldn't be in a position where you're having to tell him that. You also shouldn't be telling him that. That's the coach's job, and the player himself should know these things. You're sort of highlighting that this player is incapable of doing something, perhaps something small, that you think he should be able to do. You should be taking that on board, and you should then exercise your decision-making in whether to keep that player, whether to get a different type of player, whether to get a player specifically who can do the things you want in this sense. In Season 7, there was an episode where Reginald tells Svenskeren that he doesn't want him to invade and die 1v1 to the jungler in any of their next games. Now again, we can understand that Svenskeren might have invaded, might have died to the jungler, and might have put his team in a bad situation. But first of all, it has to be Svenskeren's prerogative on when he invades and how he plays the jungler position. He is the jungler, that is his job, that is what he's supposed to do. Reginald isn't delegating Svenskeren even the job of how to play jungler fully as other junglers get. Secondly, it's the job of Svenskeren's coach to tell Svenskeren when and how to jungle and to critique him and to ask him to do different things. When the owner comes in this way, again, he's not delegating. He's not even delegating on a player level. Obviously, another aspect would be forcing shot calling onto Bjergsen for so many seasons, when Bjergsen seemingly is a player who doesn't have a good feel for overall team shot calling. He's never really excelled in it, and it might to some degree have taken away from his individual game, and he's obviously a star player at his position. Now, we understand that Reginald in Season 2 and Season 3 was a shot caller, and he was a star player, and he was the mid laner. First of all, very different game, which I think is an issue as you see with how he's coaching some of these players. Secondly, that doesn't mean Bjergsen is. That doesn't mean it fits Bjergsen. And so you can't force Bjergsen to be like you when it isn't necessary, especially because this ties into another aspect, the idea of telling people what boots to buy or not to flash or that they should be the shot caller. This is an elite organization in League of Legends. This is a team in TSM who can target and secure the services of most players in the world. And by that, I mean, as in they could have had Praying Gorilla as their bot lane. They could have had some superstar players, their jungler. They could have had some amazing Korean top laner if they'd wanted. It's not like they're a team with limited options. So when they don't get these aspects, a really good shot caller or someone who can play a role and doesn't need to be told not to do things silly like flash forwards or invade at the wrong times, ultimately that responsibility does come back to Reginald again. Like, he could recruit these players if he wanted to. Admittedly, again, I will credit him. He did try to do this at the end of Season 5 when he recruited Yellowstar to the team, and he hoped he would be a shot-calling voice. Now, there were obviously flaws in that team. This is part of the team, the Woodbuck team we're talking about, which you can criticize, and there were certainly some issues with who they thought Yellowstar was going to be and the role he would play in the team that didn't work out and how the personalities all worked out. But you have to go into it with that mentality that you're going to hire the right person and delegate them to do their job. Even in terms of recruitment, as I've referenced, it doesn't feel like Reginald's done a good job delegating there, or when he's been hands-on, he's made some weird decisions. Like, he seems to have placed too much emphasis on winning NALCS. Now, he might say otherwise, might say, I'm building towards a world championship, but you look at the Season 5 lineup they had, where they just kept Santorin the whole time, and they thought that that was going to work on a world-class level at a world championship. It seems implausible, even from the beginning, to believe that that would be the case. Or that you could just keep Dyrus as your top laner the entire time, while also having Wild Turtle, a wildly erratic AD carry. So basically, Bjergsen's the only world-class damage threat you had, and your top lane is kind of like a bit washed up and can only play this one style, and you only let him play one style. You have a jungler who's not world-class and only plays one style, and you only let him play one style. And then you have Bjergsen, superstar mid laner, and then you have this erratic position for AD carry. Then you look at the fact that, yes, at times he's used his import slots up. He got Yellowstar, he had Lost Boy, he had Amazing, he had Santorin. But in Season 6 and on, he hasn't exploited the import slots. He could have gotten one of the world's best AD carries. He could have gotten one of the world's best top laners. He could have gotten one of the world's best junglers. Could have gotten one of the world's best supports. He didn't get any of these players. Instead, he's stuck with Western talent and some of the same talent, and he hasn't upgraded these positions, and he's hoped that, run it back again, let's see if things go differently the next year. And yet we're seeing some of the same issues flare up in terms of play, in terms of coaching, in terms of overall management of the squad. And yet when Reginald involves himself so much, he has to sort of be considered as a factor in two regards, as the ultimate guy making the decisions, and he's also taking over some of the smaller decisions as well. So I have to say, one issue as a pattern that I seem to have noticed about Reginald is he seems to really overreact to individual game result outcomes, especially overall losses, way too much. Like, he acts as though a loss means that all the things that went wrong in that game have to be addressed immediately, sometimes directly face-to-face and in front of the entire group, and even if that means shortcutting and short-circuiting all the rest of the coaching mechanism and hierarchy to immediately make this a point of focus, even if sometimes it's like you bought the wrong boots or don't invade so much, which might not actually be the most critical point at that moment in time, and that a coach would address separately in practice or try and gradually wean the player off. He's short-circuiting the entire system to make this a focal point. Now, that does seem like too much because, again, you're not willing to delegate. As soon as things go slightly off, as someone starts to go slightly divergent from what you want, you immediately take control. That seems like a flaw to me and an issue because he's trying to be not just a leader, he's trying to be a leader and the coach, and he's trying to be a positional coach at times. It feels like Reginald doesn't delegate enough, and he is inserting himself too much into the mechanism of how the TSM machine works. Because you look in sports at the owners who do this, and traditionally the owners that do this are not the ones that are successful. Sometimes they have good teams, but they very rarely have the ultimate success. So an obvious example that a lot of people will know from the NFL would be the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, Jerry Jones. Now, the Dallas Cowboys, to this day, a wildly popular team, still considered America's team. Yet this is a team that, first of all, because the owner has directly inserted himself and short-circuited his whole coaching and infrastructure, front office as well, infrastructure, he has had a massive impact on their squad. And as a result, the Dallas Cowboys have famously had numerous severe discipline issues with players, where players have a relationship with the owner, and so they go to the owner, and therefore the coach can't discipline them and can't get them under control and can't make them play the way he wants to because the owner likes them, and so that just cuts out that. Also, famously, the Dallas Cowboys have choked in numerous playoff settings despite having sometimes good regular season teams or good players. Then you go over to basketball and you look at the New York Knicks with James Dolan. This is a team where they've made poor recruitment decisions. They've gone through tons of coaches and never found the right coach, and then at times been unwilling to let the coach work and fire them too early, and then get players or tell the GM to get a different player because you personally want them instead of letting the GM work. And this is another person who has failed to delegate overall. So the problem here is Reginald is someone where I actually think it all stems from a very positive impulse, which is that he is someone who, throughout his history in TSM, when he built the brand, when he built the team that became the best in Season 2 from the West, in NA rather, but they were one of the best Western teams. When he built all of this up, he did a lot of it himself, and he made a lot of the decisions himself, and he benefited from those decisions himself and had success as a result. And so unfortunately, part of it still feels like if things go wrong, he thinks, right, I have to take care of this. I can take care of this right now. And I think ultimately he does have the best interests of TSM, the org, in mind. I mean, you've seen in his owner phase, he's treated the players very well. He's been very good at recruiting people he wanted, at letting people go in a very kind of reasonable manner where it's been mutually beneficial. He's someone who seems to have the best interests of the org in mind. I just think he is misguided in how he's going about it. So he's also someone who has and has repeatedly shown leadership qualities. But I think he's misdirected in how and when he applies those leadership qualities, because he doesn't seem willing to delegate leadership or authority or decision-making in key moments where you need your coach and your players to have that decision-making, because then when they figure things out themselves, they will be able to succeed on the biggest stage. They won't need you to insert yourself all the time and time again when things get really bad. So it does seem like he pulls the plug way too soon on what the player and the coaches and the overall staff is doing and tries to make the decision himself. He doesn't let his teams and coaches figure things out themselves, which is, to give you an example, a positive example, one of the best coaches of all time in sports is Phil Jackson. He coached 4 different core teams to NBA championships, because there was the Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen Bulls, which those were the only two players remaining on both the squads. He got 3 championships with each of those cores. Then you go over to the Lakers. He had 2 different cores that won 3 and 2 championships, so 5 collectively. So he won in a total of 11 NBA championships. And one of the hallmark qualities of Phil Jackson, the coach, was that when his team would be going through difficult periods in the game, he would sometimes just leave the same unit in. He wouldn't make a change. He wouldn't call a timeout, and he wouldn't tell them all exactly what they're doing wrong, because he wanted them in those moments to think back to what he'd told them to do from practice, or to see what's going on that's wrong. And star players, very intelligent players, would see things and make adjustments of their own and battle through it, experience hardship, experience the problem, see what's wrong, and try to make good decisions themselves to get out of those situations. And in doing so, he made sure all his teams were battle tested, that when he got to a playoff scenario, he didn't have to micromanage everything. He'd let his teams figure things out. He trusted that the right players and the leaders within the team would figure out what the major issues were, and then he would tweak things and he would go over the finer details in practice. And this is the approach he took, which made him one of the most successful coaches of all time. Now, I think this is something Reginald needs to look at. He needs to look at the structure of his squad, making a proper head coach role, then having someone like a Path, who's a very intelligent person in the game, be the strategical coach. So he's got someone to do the authority aspect. He's got someone from the strategical aspect. He needs to do maybe hire someone else for recruitment, or look at how to exploit his squad more in that respect and get exactly the things he needs to fill the holes that TSM has. And he also needs to figure out how to apply those positive qualities of having the best interests of TSM in mind, not wanting things to slip and people to be laissez-faire in their approach, wanting to be a leader and motivate and support his players without short-circuiting the entire approach of the players, the coaches, and the overall staff. And this is something I hope that he's going to look into. And by the way, as a detail, I actually am going to be doing an interview with Reginald about TSM and about their World Championship campaign. And this is a topic I will bring up to him, and we'll see what he has to say when the interview comes out.
Hey, this is Travis Gafford, the double lift expert, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.